risk. You know that word risk? It's part of life, isn't it? Go back a couple of years, and that wouldn't have been a controversial statement at all. But in the age of COVID, many folk have become gripped by the concept of safetyism. You know, mollycoddling on a societal level, the prioritising of safety, including so-called emotional safety above social development, new life experiences, freedom, and virtually everything else. So just how did we become so risk-averse? Is the pandemic solely to blame, or is there more at play? To discuss this tonight, I'm joined in the studio by the author and barrister Adam King, the man behind the column "COVID Safetyism Has Gone Mad for Unheard." Adam, great to have you here.
Pleasure to be here, Dan.
Safetyism, is this all the fault of COVID?
Certainly not. I think the ground was laid for many years before COVID came along. It's perhaps fairly obvious to say that if COVID had come along 20, perhaps even 10 years earlier, the level of restrictions on our freedom that have come to pass would not have occurred. Now, that's partly, of course, because we wouldn't have had the technology to keep society half running as we have managed to do 20 years ago. But it's also, and perhaps mainly, about the changing attitudes in society towards risk.
But that's going to make living life pretty impossible, is it not?
If we carry on in this direction much further, I think it might.
And legally, where does that change things? Because, of course, the law doesn't change.
Well, the law does change. The common law, as it's known, that is to say, law made by judges rather than by Parliament in statute. The common law does change, and it changes slowly in response, in part, to society's changing attitudes. Now, when I found myself thinking about why safetyism had taken the direction it had taken before COVID hit.
Taken hold, you might even say.
You might well. I found myself looking back at the earlier cases, the mid-20th century cases where the House of Lords, now the Supreme Court, considered this sort of thing for the first, second, third time. And I was struck, as any lawyer is when they read these cases, by the very different attitudes that the senior judiciary had in those days to risk.
Including death, presumably.
Yes, I think that's probably fair to say, including death, yes. But there's this trope, isn't there, that this idea that health and safety has gone mad. I should say that I wouldn't necessarily say that health and safety has yet gone mad. But what we consider to be reasonable as a society has shifted, case by case, year by year. That's been a slow process, and we haven't really noticed it.
But probably sped up these past 18 months?
Very much so, in my opinion.
I agree.
Yeah, I'm pleased to hear it. I think we are in real danger of going over a precipice on this. It has become almost, I think not quite, but it has become almost socially unacceptable to say that COVID safetyism has gone mad. Perhaps there's no need to put it as provocatively as gone mad, but even to say that it's gone too far.
Yeah.
Jonathan Sumption, Lord Sumption, great man in my opinion, indeed, at the beginning of the COVID pandemic and the beginning of the last 18 months, and several times along the way, has come in for some extraordinary criticism for saying some perfectly sensible things that you might not agree with, but it has become even amongst lawyers, slightly embarrassing to say that you're on Sumption's side.
It's just despicable, because I think, well, I agree with 99.999%, if not 100% of everything Sumption has said throughout this crisis. I think he's been one of the few brave voices. He was the first guest on my show, actually.
Was he?
First ever guest on my show, yeah. And it really worries me that people are scared to speak up against some of this madness. And let's be honest, it is madness, for example, making it illegal for a healthy young person, say 18, 19, 20, to go out and experience the world, to travel because of an illness that will not severely impact them. That's madness, and that's where I believe safetyism takes us. It's mad, too, to deprive young people, especially disadvantaged young people, of education when, for an illness that will have virtually no effect on them. In fact, they may not even know they have said illness to protect elderly people in society. That is mad to me. So I think we've made loads of these safetyism choices which have a very real-world effect, especially on young people.
I couldn't agree more. The risk to the elderly and vulnerable is not a risk that should be ignored. Of course, Lord Sumption, no one in their right mind would say that we should ignore that. But we must strike a balance.
Yeah.
And now that we have got the vaccine, and now that...
And testing and a whole load of things. This is no longer a new virus, is it? So we make a choice between letting the safetyism change our way of life forever, or starting to say, OK, there's a small risk, there's lots of ways that we mitigate this risk, and let's deal with it. But, look, I want to bring my superstar panel in on this. We've got the columnist and broadcaster Carol Malone here, the senior reporter at the newspaper Benjamin Butterworth, and the social commentator Esther Kraku. Now, Benjamin, are you risk-averse these days? Do you embrace this idea of safetyism? Because knowing you, I would probably say yes, you do.
I mean, look, I try to be careful and respectful of others and to not put other people at risk. I'm fully vaccinated and I am leading a roughly similar life now, but I'm still certainly more careful than 2 years ago before the pandemic, because I'm aware that there is this risk of getting sick, or more importantly, making other people sick. So what I...
Unless you're in GAY nightclub.
But hang on, I think you should have to be vaccinated, or any other nightclub for that matter, other nightclubs are available.
Well, you think people should be locked in their houses if they're not vaccinated, according to what you told me last week?
Well, this is the thing. You know, when we're talking about risk, I disagree with this idea that people shouldn't have had the restrictions on their lives, because until we had the vaccine, you couldn't isolate the risk. It was a risk that applied to everyone because it was a contagious disease, and that's why I was happy and it was right for me to be locked up at home, just as it was for everybody else, whether you're old or young.
So let me bring Adam in on this, because actually, Adam, the reality is, and it depresses me very much, but probably the majority of the population agree with Benjamin. They say people shouldn't have the right to take their own risks and make their own judgments because it might affect other people in society. So someone like Benjamin says, actually, if you're not vaccinated, stay locked up in the house. You lose your right to live life. Now, obviously, I very much disagree with that, but we've got a growing number of the population who think that folk like Benjamin are completely right.
Absolutely. And we have to take account of that in a democracy. The polls have not been on the side of the anti-lockdown brigade for the almost entire period of the pandemic. But polls should not dictate policy. There should not be a simple pipeline from one to the other. What we need is responsible government taking the right decisions and making the right balances, and that doesn't just involve looking at what YouGov said.
But if I may just ask my question, what's the appropriate level of risk then?
What's the appropriate level of risk in what respect?
You say this isn't right, so where on earth do you draw the line?
Where people draw the line for themselves. The appropriate level of risk is when you make an independent assessment for your own health. That should have always been this. Once the vaccines came
Yes, Esther, I'm with you.
And once people had the choice to make autonomous decisions on their health based on the fact that we actually had this medical miracle available to allow people to not spread the virus in the same way, that should have been the point where we actually said, OK, risk assessment is on you, like an adult, not like a child.
Well, I agree.
Because the point of
Carol,
the state
I
is
presume you come down somewhere in the middle of
Yeah,
this.
I mean, I'm interested in what Adam said. It was talking before. He said there were signs of this safetyism long before COVID took hold. And tell me what they are, and also tell me what it is in the British psyche because this really surprised me that we were so compliant with having our freedoms taken away. What is it about us? I thought we were more bullish than that, but as a society, we've completely caved into everything the government said we had to do.
Well, I think part of the problem, or at least part of the reason for it, is that so much of our conversation now takes place in public. Not long ago, there were only a handful of people involved in a public conversation. Now, it's almost everybody. If you want to talk at all, you're talking on social media and everyone can hear you. Now, the effect that has is to make people express more virtuous sentiments.
Yeah.
Now, there's nothing wrong with expressing virtuous sentiments, of course, encouraging...
It's not necessarily what people think, and their behaviour isn't necessarily backed up by what they're saying.
Exactly. And so, by those means, it becomes very socially dangerous to express what you actually think is a fair balance, and instead it's easier to adopt a rather extreme anti-risk position.
But
Absolutely
we got scared, didn't we? And we became very compliant. The government was even surprised at how compliant we were as a nation.
I know, but they love it now. They love it now.
They do love it now.
It's a fascinating conversation. Adam King, thank you so much for having it here on Uncancelled.
Thank you very much.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows, and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.